have this joint training session? Why is this important? Many of you have been on your commission for a very long time. I've been there for a long time, I've been on the planning commission. It's really critical that we have regular training to make sure that we keep in mind the principles and the training involved in our particular activities, whether it be as a village council member, or a planning commission member, or zoning board of appeals member. So I deeply appreciate you as all making the time to be involved in this training. I look forward to
I'm Lori Marston. I'm with the Chat Institute of DePaul. The workshop is co-sponsored by the Chat Institute as well as the Illinois Chapter of the American Bank Association. Because of the recording, yeah, okay, sorry. So my background is I spent 20 years in public sector planning. My last position was as Community Development Director for the Village of Wilmette, and then since then I've been doing consulting work and working with DePaul. I'm going to have Bob introduce himself.
Thanks, Lori. I'm Bob Sullivan. I used to be planning director for the Village of Orland Park for many years, but I've also done other things in other towns and real estate appraisal and consulting and things too. We're very happy to be here. I'm familiar with this area, and hopefully we'll have a good session. We do want to emphasize that it's very informal, so please, if you have a question or just speak up, or you have a comment, just speak up. So it's better if we talk to you and you talk to us, so that we cover what you need to have covered. And we already understand from Lauren, there's a couple things that we need to go through quickly, which we will, but we really want to focus on the things that you're interested in.
Your packet has a copy of the PowerPoint for everybody. I also just passed out an evaluation form. When we're done at the end, we ask that you do this anonymously, the evaluation. We do not want people's names on it. I'll just take you a minute or two, and it's very helpful to us. We use these evaluations to improve future workshops. And so far, we've been doing this since 2011. We've done 82 workshops, primarily in the Chicago area, but some of them have been downstate as well. I'm also going to pass around a sign-in sheet. Don't worry about the numbers on it, and I'm going to split it up and pass it from both ends. Just print your name, because we will do little certificates at the end and email them to Lauren to be distributed, and so it's easier for us if you will print your name for us. And the Chaddock Institute also has an email list. We don't send out stuff very often. It's not like you're going to get something every day from us. If you'd like to be on the email list, just add your email address. If you don't want to be on the email list, that's totally fine. We just are making it available to you if you're interested. So I think we're ready for Bob.
Thank you. Okay, we covered that. Just the agenda. Oh. Yeah, please, if you wouldn't mind, just to go around the table and just introduce yourselves. Apologize.
Commissioner Nicole Mills, recreation, water, sewers, roads, that stuff.
John Hogan,
Jim Bedwise, Commissioner. Jeff Marsh, Zoning Board of Appeals.
Nancy Comer, zoning board of appeals.
Jerry Hill, Zoning Board of Appeals.
Jack Martin, Zoning Board of Appeals.
Matt Zill, Planning Commission. Rich DeWar, Planning Commission.
Julie Kay, planning commission.
Daniel McCarthy, Planning Commission.
Ed Larson, Planning Commission.
Phil Langley, Planning Commission.
Lauren Cross, community development director.
And Rick Fagan, village manager.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Daniel Burnham just is a Chicago area icon for planning, and the only reason we're showing this really is we like to mention that when you're traveling or reading about a place, if you find something that really struck you as a nice thing to do, or a really smart idea or a beautiful feature of a town, bring it back, because beautiful vacation towns can also be incorporated partway into your own town. So we just are emphasizing to think outside the box, and when you see something nice, you might come back and bring it to Palos Park and talk about it. The comprehensive plan, the main thing about this is it is a statute of the state of Illinois that authorizes this, and it has police power to it in guiding development, and so it's a very important document, and we're going to go through more of it later.
Yeah, it sounds a little.
Okay. The Plan Commission reviews the comprehensive plan prior to the village board, and the thing that you want to do here is figure out what you want to be in a few years. Usually it's about a 10 or 20 year time frame. To say you're going to figure out what you're going to do in 50 years is not very realistic, and to say what you're going to do in 1 year isn't that helpful. So usually about a 10, 15, 20 year time frame. In your case, you've just annexed a new area to the west. So it becomes very important to take a look at that property and figure out what's the best land use, how to set it up, what's the infrastructure that you need. The zoning, on the other hand, is a very specific type of thing. It's regulation of development. Comprehensive plan is kind of a general guideline. The zoning is law. The zoning is very specific. So back to the comprehensive plan, covers these things which are kind of obvious, but sometimes it's not very easy to figure some of these things out. For instance, land use. A lot of towns will designate massive areas for commercial, hoping that they'll get a huge tax base out of it, and that might not be realistic. So whoever you have doing your comprehensive plan, hopefully has some experience and really analyzes the market for this area and helps you decide what would be appropriate for, say, commercial, and where would you put it. You have some traditional locations that are very small, and then you have the LaGrange Road. So what's appropriate, what's likely to actually happen? Should it be a mixed use? Should you have high-density housing near it? There's all kinds of questions to answer on that. With the environment, the beautiful environment in Palos Park with the hills and the trees, it's very obvious that there's been a lot of effort to preserve that in the past, and I'm sure you want to emphasize that in the future too. Public facilities, you have your train station. I don't know if there's plans for additional parking. LaGrange Road, fortunately, was recently done. There's, of course, other issues such as bike paths, sidewalks, things like that, depending on where it is, horse paths, whatever it may be.
Just add that the village council did just authorize us to enter into a contract for service policy will need to update the comprehensive plan with respect to the West Grove area. So we're beginning to undertake that process and just do some background work at this time. So that'll be coming forward here in the next several months.
Great. Yeah, if you don't have an updated comprehensive plan, I mean, you need one obviously because you have a brand new area. But even if you don't have a brand new area and your plan is old, if somebody comes in and wants to do something that you don't want, the comprehensive plan isn't going to be as helpful to you because they can point to it and say, hey, you haven't updated this in 20 years, it's out of date, it's not very reliable, you can't count on that too much. Whereas if it's within the last 5 years, say, it's considered by courts to be much more reliable, and it's a tool that you can use more than a 20-year-old or 25-year-old plan. The comprehensive plan addresses all these things, but I know somebody mentioned historic preservation. It allows you to do things like set up a historic preservation district and create some design guidelines in there. It can help you set up conservation areas to preserve natural areas. So there's all kinds of great things that you can do with the basis in the comprehensive plan. Because you can point to it later on, because it is going to be approved by your village board, and it's a legal document. You can use it to help you get what you want later on. This is a real important part, especially in a smaller community, that it really needs to be something that everybody feels they had a part in, and that they're kind of agreeing to it for the most part. Because if it's done just by a consultant with nobody participating in the community, I mean, you can imagine that it's not going to have heavy support in the community either. You also don't get as good of a product if the community is not involved, because the residents are the ones who kind of know what's been happening, what are issues, what are problems. They see things that could be better. So ideally, I'm sure there will be a good public process. Once the plan is done, and again, it's a general guideline, it's not a real specific thing, you can implement that plan in a number of ways. It defines your area that you're going to annex in the future. I don't know if there's anything left for you guys to annex, but in many towns, there is. Okay. You kind of set up where's that line? Is there an intergovernmental agreement with your neighboring town? Or if everybody's fighting and not cooperating, then you want to set up where you want to be in the future, and hopefully you can work it out. But you want to know what that is. And, for instance, you base it on where can you serve it with utilities? Is there a huge barrier between you and that property? Is there an interstate between you that might not make sense? So there's a lot of things like that to look at. Where do you want to eventually end up with your boundaries? The infrastructure investments have a lot to do with your financial situation, and some of the things you might want to do won't be budgeted because there isn't the money at the moment. So you could consider things like a TIF district, tax financing district later on, to possibly pay for some of the infrastructure improvements if you're really trying to focus on, say, a little downtown area that you want to really kind of build up and emphasize, and maybe create a little town square, or those kinds of things. Make it something and to try to draw more investment. It might take a little bit of money to get it going, and that's the way to do it. But again, your comprehensive plan is going to hopefully point to you where you would want to do that and why. Other things like code enforcement, your groups really aren't involved with the property maintenance. Procedures like design guidelines. This is something that's real important when you're reviewing a plan. Rather than having a lot of personal opinions on what's being presented, you really want to have some specific guidelines in your ordinance, so that you can actually point to things that are approved guidelines in your ordinance and say, this is why I think this is a problem. You need to upgrade your architecture or your landscaping. Here's why: because you're not meeting these 4 or 5 standards that are in our code. Utility lines, that's a financial decision too, but like along LaGrange Road, it's very expensive to bury utilities, but that might make sense because it's the gateway to a town. It's the main traffic way that everyone sees. So you want to have an image presented to the majority of the people coming through. That's where you would focus, because that's what going to be numbers when they come through. The plan does need to be changed periodically. Again, we mentioned about 5 years is a typical number. We'll keep going unless somebody has questions or any comments. We'll go through quickly on this. Just there's a legal background for zoning, and it started out with tenements in New York where they didn't have enough air, or there was fire issues and all kinds of things. So then the code started to be developed that separated buildings enough to not catch fire with each other, that brought air and brought sun in, tried to reduce some of the problems that were in the tenement areas. That's the basis for it, but it's obviously developed a lot since then. The important thing here is that it's a police power, and it's a very strong police power, because you're really regulating in pretty much detail what people can do with their property. We don't like that, but it is the code, it is the law. You have the right to do it. Comprehensive plan is going to kind of help you with your community character and economic development. One of the important things here too is that your codes have to be applied consistently. If you're treating people differently based on other reasons, different reasons, obviously it's a legal issue. So you got to be very careful with that. You got to be very careful that the process that everybody goes through when they come through and apply for something is the same for everybody. And it also has to be very clear and consistent, telling them here's how you come through and do this process. And one of the things you have to avoid is, say you don't want something coming in, something that might be tempted to keep delaying it. We're going to push you off 3 months, we're going to push you off 6 months. There's a certain amount of time that's just not reasonable. If they have all their information you requested, then you get a due process that need to be moved through. And if it's a bad project, you won't know, but the way to prevent a project from happening is not to just delay the process, because it's just not very legal or fair. These are just other things that you use in a municipality, and if anybody has any questions or comments on some specific things they've noticed that they've had problems with, we'd be happy to try to bring up examples or answer them, but we're going to kind of quickly go through these things. I might just throw out like fences. There's kind of some goofy things that you have a neighbor and you both want fences. So what do? Just put the 2 fences up against each other? Do you leave no man's land in the middle? One higher than the other? One is a chain link so you can see through the other guy's fence. There's a lot of things that can happen with just a fence. So those are things to think about and put in your code, and you can address those. Signs too. Signs can be crazy, and do you want electronic signs? World Park just went through that, where they were trying to, a lot of the businesses were trying to put on electronic signs in the range of other places. And the idea was always try to have kind of a calm situation when you go through, so they're not flashing messages and doing all kinds of stuff. And fortunately, from my opinion, they said no. But height and size, how far is the setback? How many signs do you get? What do you do on the building? How big can it be on the building? All these things. Can they flash? Can you have artwork? What can it say? For instance, it's reasonable to have a message, like one message board on there for a percentage of the sign. They can say something, but the main reason for a sign is identifying a property, identifying a business. Not to say, quote for 159, flashing by, things like that, because it's just not necessary, it's not helpful. You might have neighboring communities that have different sign ordinances, and so there might be battle of the signs, because Orland did that with Tinley on 159th Street with the car dealers. So there's all kinds of things that come in. Tree preservation, there's a lot of different ordinances on that, and they vary. Sometimes you'll have a heritage tree program where, say, a tree that's 24 inches in diameter or bigger has to get removed. That seems to be helpful in a lot of places. Otherwise, people are pretty free just to remove them at will, and it depends what you want your character of your community to be. And here you have a lot of trees, so you might want to have some kind of regulation and control and preservation approaches on that. Yeah, this speaks for itself. Nobody's the same. When you have a project coming through, there isn't necessarily a really easy answer or a completely right answer. It could be a compromise. Some of it you might not like, some of it's okay. But in the end, there are legal limitations, so you can't go too far outside your own codes, telling them what to do. If they meet your codes and they meet your zoning ordinance, unless there's something else massively wrong, you're going to probably have to approve it. And again, your comprehensive plan is what you use to begin with to determine what you want for zoning and determine what you want there. But once you have those codes in place, if somebody completely meets your codes, it'd be tough in court to beat that. This one, a lot of people think that it's, ordinances are telling me what I cannot do with my property, but it's really to protect your own property. The person can't raise up his yard next door to you and drain into your yard, or maybe the location of an air conditioning unit or something is required to be a certain place so it won't impact the neighbor as much. There's all kinds of things like that you are protected as a property owner as well as all your neighbors from things that might be done that are not good for you. Height is another thing. You might have a requirement that says if you have a home that's so high, maybe they can't build something that's 30 feet higher next door within a certain distance because it blocks your sun. It can look bad. Things like that. We talked about these pretty much. Everybody here is pretty familiar with these items. I'm not quite sure if Palos Park has a lot coverage requirement. That really comes into play because when your stormwater management plans are drawn up, the engineers figure a certain coverage of property by the built environment, and so they're counting on a certain amount of land to absorb water by flooding. If you don't have a lot coverage limit, then somebody can keep adding stuff on their property. I'm putting in a pool, I'm putting on a patio, I'm going to add onto my house. And if a bunch of people do that, then all of a sudden you have issues with flooding, as well as aesthetics, lack of usable yard, and all kinds of things that pop up. Zoning districts, these are kind of conventional ones. Mixed-use district can give you a lot of different things, retail, office, residential. In Palos Park, it would probably be a relatively small area that you would consider for that. Overlay districts, there can be a lot of those kinds of things depending on what you're trying to do. It could be a historic overlay district, could be arts district, or all kinds of things like that, depending on what you come up with in your comprehensive plan again. These are two very different things. Your text amendment, it requires a public hearing to change your text, and many times you have cases over the years where something keeps coming up that maybe didn't make too much sense. Like it's overly restrictive on maybe allowing a studio in a garage or something. People would like to do it, but your code says no. Rather than just keep saying no, it's rather than talking about it, possibly amending the code, which would be a text amendment. And we saw a lot of those in Orland Park, and we always said it was a living document. You're always going to change it because you're going to find things that don't make sense or times have changed. And so it's time to keep taking a look at it and make changes as needed. The map amendment is just the actual zoning map where you're going to change property lines, or when you annex, you're going to add areas to it. As far as changing the zoning districts from one to another, if the property owner isn't requesting it and you're down zoning it for some reason, you probably should have a really good reason to do that. But if they're requesting a zoning and it's incompatible based on the comprehensive plan or for other reasons, then it's something you don't want to do. Just quickly, permitted uses, it's something as of right. Like a single-family home, I'm allowed to do it in this district. And if I meet other codes, it's as simple as that. Variance, I'm requesting a change to the code. Maybe my house isn't quite the setback that's required. And due to the site and due to my architecture, I'm going to request a 2-foot variance. Is it reasonable? Is there a really unique hardship here for this? Or maybe you should have bought a bigger lot, so it's something to consider. But if you're going to give a variance, there needs to be a specific, unique hardship to give it. Special use is usually applied to things that may have negative impacts on neighbors, on the community. Or, I mean, examples are places that serve alcohol or a large establishment that generates lots of traffic. It can be, some kind of retail, it can be a place of worship, it can be or something that you consider noisy, it could be a car repair shop, and all those things that might have problems and affect neighbors. You want to consider as special uses. And again, as you go along, if something pops up that maybe should have been one, or one that seems like it's unreasonable, it's a special use. For instance, say if restaurants are special uses, it makes sense if they're near homes maybe, but if it's in the middle of a commercial area and with parking and a building around it, maybe it doesn't make sense to really have a special use for that. So that's something to consider. In plan unit developments, rather than having constant variances and things to the code to do a plan unit development, it's set up so that, say you have a wooded area, a wetland, other things that you want to preserve. The developer then comes in and says, well, I'll preserve all this, I'll provide park space, but because of this unique site, I'd like to have some different kinds of setbacks from my units, and maybe have a higher density area on one end because I'm preserving the other end. So it's a trade-off between the developer and the community saying, okay, we'll consider the higher density, we'll consider lower setbacks over here because you are preserving the area over here and you're doing some good things for the community over here. So it's a trade-off. Somebody who comes in and just gives nothing and just wants more density and lower setbacks and things, I mean, they have to give you a reason to consider something like that. And if you are applying conditions to say you're giving approving a project, and there are a number of items that you still want to have addressed because you're not satisfied with what it is. Say it might be landscaping. You're really low on landscaping. You're not meeting our code. You need to upgrade that. So we're going to put a condition on that to do this or that. Another thing might be for traffic. Say it's a very small development along a street, generating very little, and you're going to add a condition to provide a full left turn lane and a traffic signal for that project. That's just unreasonable. You're putting way too much on a small project. If it's a huge traffic generator, a big commercial center or a very large residential development, it's very reasonable to add a condition so you need a left turn lane or you need something other than that. Well, we kind of talked about this. We talked about the first item. Any questions or comments on this section?
You mentioned that, excuse me, comprehensive plans sort of get stale. You want to update those. A zoning ordinance, obviously, that's a law. It's a little bit different. Is it beneficial to get rid of things that are outdated, or is there a reason to keep updating? Is there a period at which items in your zoning ordinance are stale? Say you have a section in there that says where you're allowed to use telegraph offices.
Right, well, yeah, that kind of stuff. Technology is a big thing.
Is there any grounds to challenge your zoning ordinance based on things that are just outdated? Or that's the law.
Well, if you just have things left over from that don't really hurt anybody or affect anything, not really, it just looks out and have it in there. But say if you have to come up with technology, for instance, somebody wants to put solar or some wind item or something else, or geothermal heating or something, it's better to have that in there now because it's out there. Instead of having somebody come in and say, I want to do this, well, you can't, it's not in our code. Not that we don't want it, but it's just not in our code. That's not a good position to be in. So when that comes up, then you want to say, okay, we'll put it in our code. And fortunately, things that are in the public domain, you can just copy. You can quickly find, a copy of a case of a good ordinance on that topic, and mostly copy it and adjust it a bit. So it isn't really that hard to update for those kinds of things. If there's something that just makes no sense, like maybe prohibiting other uses for like a studio on top of a garage or something, it seems reasonable, it's just not in there, then you just change it if you want to change it. But I would say technology is probably the biggest thing that people miss out on.
And the Great Recession, too. We found a lot of communities that had written a zoning ordinance or a comprehensive plan shortly before the Great Recession are going back and making some changes simply because so many circumstances have changed and some of the things that seemed to be a good idea 10 years ago just aren't going to happen. So that would be, and if a community is growing really rapidly, they will change their plan or their zoning ordinance more often than someplace that's completely built out.
It's better to try to address these items proactively rather than someone comes in and says, I want to do this, and then you don't really have a ground to say yes or no. It's,
Right.
you can't, at that point, change it. You can address that. The first person.
Well, I mean, sometimes you can just say, you know, we can maybe get this through in 3 months or 2 months or something, so if you can wait.
Someone comes in and wants to do something, then you change it so they can't do it, that doesn't.
Oh, so they can't do it?
Well, I mean, I don't know, I'm just saying.
Well, you can't do that because
Yeah,
if
right.
they can do it now,
But you may have an opinion about an issue, you know, the
Yeah.
community may have an opinion about an issue, but it's not in the zoning ordinance, there's no ability to point to that as the reason why something's not moved forward.
Right, but sometimes, you know, you can just say, we'll try to do this in the next few months. And if it's like someone wants to improve the garage or their home, they can't now, but it seems reasonable what they're asking, they're just gonna have to take the risk that it'll happen. Otherwise they just can't do it, so.
Are a lot of towns downsizing their housing because of the rate collapse of 08?
You know,
I think they're more likely to allow more multifamily units than they used to in kind of mixed-use areas or downtown type things. But single-family neighborhoods that are already set up the way they are, I mean, the residents usually are not interested in seeing that happen. Even if, it may happen in the future some more, but I would say right now, like a single-family neighborhoods, usually not. It's more the mixed-use stuff that changes their scene.
Oh, that's a good point, multi-family and so on, especially with the population aging.
Right.
And the baby boomers hit a point where they want to downsize. There's no place to go.
And the millennials don't like to buy homes, it seems, so
Pardon?
the millennials are renting more than buying homes.
Right.
So that makes some sense too. But you might consider in-law units on single-family lots. Actually, Rowland does allow that. I mean, not many people use it, but that's one way to address some of the populations, elderly parents, or or a handicapped child or something. You can possibly add on. It's very controlled, and there's guidelines for it. But that's one way to maybe increase the use of a property without changing things too much.
and you obviously have, at some point, have changed your zoning ordinance to allow senior housing because you have the Sunrise development right down the street here. And so you're, which is different than other forms of independent senior housing. But, so you're allowing those sorts of alternative housing types in the community to accommodate the desires of people that are living here and may not be able to live independently anymore, and providing those different types of housing so people can stay in the community. What's on yours or mine? The annexation.
All right, are you really involved or very familiar with the whole annexation thing that's been going on in Palos Park? Is everybody really familiar with that already, or is that not been so involved in your areas? Are you very familiar with the whole annexation process and what's going on in Palos Park? Pretty much.
I'm just not sure what we actually annexed. I mean, how far does it really go? Because I know Cottrell is pretty far out there.
Right.
And then, Right, I know the four, you know,
What's the
Ludwig Farms.
westernmost boundary?
Yeah.
Is there a street or is that just
Archer?
a
I
property?
mean, you got Archer, you got Cotton Hill,
Right.
so, yeah, so where does it?
Very helpful.
Yes, I'm ready to look like this and like that.
Yeah, that's
That's
what I
not gonna be helpful.
Well, in the meantime, while he's getting that, you as a village have the right to comment on any development in unincorporated Cook County or rural, but within a mile and a half of your boundary, if someone's proposing something, you have a right to comment, and if you object, there's a higher vote total that's needed to approve it in that county. So you have a little bit of control over the mile and a half area around you that way.
Oh, I wasn't going to interrupt you. I had a question on what the village is annexed. So I'm just going to give you a couple. Bell Road is the north-south here. 101st Street, this is McCarthy Road, 111, or Main Street coming in here. This is Archer Avenue. So Cog Hill straddles Archer Avenue, goes north of Main Street into an industrial area, but has approximately 1,000 acres in the Cog Hill area north of McCarthy Road. Glen Eagles, south of McCarthy, and it's just to the west of the Highlines in here. Midiron is on Bell Road, adjacent to the Highlines, and they connect in through Glen Eagles. Then Ludwig Farm, below Glen Eagles, connects into 131st Street. So this whole area was what was annexed as about almost 1,500 acres. The village also annexed part of Forest Preserve, but that will obviously not be developed. So hopefully that gives you an idea. If you have any questions, please see me at any time of calling.
You may want to leave that.
Yep.
So, you know, those areas may at some point come before the Plan Commission if there's a prospective change in use to what's going to happen there in the future, so.
We don't have any plans from any of the property owners, but the long-term vision that we're hearing from these property owners is that Cog Hill, when I say long-term, I'm talking 25, 30 years. Cog Hill has 4 golf courses right now, and a lot of undeveloped property that's not golf course.
It's attached to it or not?
Well, it's all part of their property too.
Okay.
So if you look at what's southeast of Archer, that's not golf course. And that's probably another third
Yeah.
of the property.
I had quite a conversation with the owner out there. I was like, oh, my house, maybe it was 2 years ago, I had a breakfast out there. Just on the farm of breakfast.
Got a chance to have it.
And, yeah, so, but, I don't think he has any, ideas of how much of this particular time.
Well, their vision,
Do they think they're gonna go?
their vision is to develop a longer golf course. They have 4 golf courses now. Eventually, they want to have 2 golf courses. Golf course destination. They want to attract a major tournament to Cog Hill. In order to do that, you have to have on-site housing. So that's the
He was
long
kind of
term.
talking about that a little bit, but yeah.
That's their long-term plan, to have it to be a destination golf resort, maybe a hotel, convention center. Bloody Eagles has no plans to develop, but I would not be surprised if in the next 5 years they sold the property to develop. Whether the owners would keep the golf course all the boards and with the property owners to inform them what would the market dictate for those properties. What we want to see there, all that kind of feedback that would be involved in that planning process. I don't remember the comprehensive plan process that we had probably 10 years now, leading up to the 2009 plan. It's a lengthy process to look into it. And in this case, private property owners and what their vision is for the property and what will be supported. So to the west of Cotton Hill, that white property is also a property that might be annexed. No, that's not Cotton Hill, it's Commsission. What else is out there?
There's, Mount Sissy, they have the convents out there and also the friary.
So that would be further potential annexes. We've had no discussions with those folks. But we just, kind of very informally had conversations like that.
And this old guy was really interested in us coming out there. That, this association village.
Yeah. The Johnson family is, their first grade.
Okay, it reminds me it's time to go back.
Well, and they live, read, golf. That's what they do. That course is all over the place, St. Andrews, and of course, up north, and of course, in Georgia. So that's what this family does. I don't know if you are familiar with Joe Johnson, he's a father. Frank Johnson, who's passed away many years ago now. He was kind of the father of high-level public golf. Golf open, country club golf open to the public. So he's known. If you talk to Frank Johnson, he will tell stories about Lee Trevino playing golf with his dad and sitting around playing cards down in the basement of the cocktail. That's the kind of person that Joe Jackson was. He knew everybody. So it's a nice family to be associated with.
So just to follow the mayor, I mean, the area that is not annexed will likely be included in your comprehensive plan, area to be planned anyway. So it doesn't matter if it's annexed or not. If it's not part of another municipality and it makes sense to include it in your comprehensive plan, you will. And you may annex it later. And speaking of annexation, it may be involuntary sometimes. And what that means is usually, say there's a unincorporated area that has a terribly loud and 4 a.m. license, and they park on a public highway. Rick is laughing because this has happened in Orland. And the village decided we need to get rid of this. So according to the ordinances, the law, if you surround it and it's less than 60 acres, I believe, you have the right to just annex it. You just go in and you annex it, and that's it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And you have control over that problem property. But if the area is larger than that and you don't surround it, you can't force annex. But you can go in and you can negotiate with the person to possibly annex in, or you work with the county to start fining them or giving them tickets or whatever they're doing. There's all kinds of ways to do that. But annexation can be involuntary. And there isn't much the property owner can do about that.
Can I just amplify one more? So, just in case you're curious, the light red represents Vermont. darker red represents the parcels that are involved in our quo pronto action.
State's
That the
attorney.
That the state's attorney is now fighting with Lamont. So when Lamont sued to block the Cocktail and Eagle farm annexation, we filed a quo pronto action, which was taken up by the state's attorney to separate those dark red parcels from Lamont because they're not contiguous. Contiguous has a very legal definition, which the Lamont parcels don't meet. They basically annex wherever they wanted and hope that no one called upon it. So that suit is still ongoing. I just want to give you the full description of why the red parcels. This is our quo pronto map. You can see the little red parcel that's right in the middle of all the fields, dark on Bell Road.
I was going to ask you that,
Well, it's right at the
that
corner
was
of
like that home, that village that has all the homes in there?
No, well, there's
What is that? What's the name?
Sunset, there's a
Sun Hill.
Sun Hill.
Sun Hill subdivision is not part
Oh,
of
that
it.
is the one.
Catholic
that-
Church.
But anyway,
Any equestrian estates? Equestrian estates?
question, yes.
That's all.
That white to the east of Bell Road is question.
So that way up on the right hand.
Okay, all that.
That's question.
That's the question. So it's still in discussion on that, there's a, right on the corner of 131st and Bell, it's that playing field for soccer, or I'm not sure if it's football, or is that the one with the white, it's like a white circle in the middle of the dark red, or the white square?
That's more of the.
Okay, we're pointing here. That would be this parcel down here. This is the 131st Street, so this piece down here. And it's where the high, that's also part of the,
Right.
part of this too.
Okay, the annexation agreements, usually when you bring somebody in, they want something, you want something, so you're gonna try to set up some parameters. And often, when you annex somebody, you may not give them a zoning right away, because it takes away some of your negotiating ability as a municipality. But sometimes there's an agreement that designates areas for open space, designates densities for residential development. All kinds of things can be put in there. But that varies from town to town.
So just, a little bit of background on these annexations. Because the Lamont filed suit, we're in the process of trying to work towards annexation. Because the Lamont filed suit, we annexed without an annexation. So all that area is zoned R1 with grandfather existing use now. And so all that will be negotiated at some point when each property owners bring development plans. It was a legal faith by the property owners to come into Palos Park with the idea that we would work out the development later. But it was kind of forced
somebody comes in and they have no development planned, typically it is the lowest density, like R1 or something. Typically that's what happens, is they just come in with that density, because there's nothing that they've told you they're going to do, so you don't want to hand them any zoning to do something that you don't want. So they just come in with that and you go from there. But if somebody is ready to develop and they're coming in, it's all one process typically, where they're annexed and there's an approval for their project at the same time, close at the same time. And this is another scenario where it's a lawsuit. It's a little more
It's an
difficult.
unusual
Yeah.
circumstance.
You know, just to highlight, because, I mean, I don't think people say it enough. It really was like an amazing leap of faith that those landowners put mostly in you, because you are the face of Hills Park with the whole community, you know, and knowing what we are about. So when it goes to a public process, they kind of trust that we are not going to try to, excuse the expression, screw them in any way, but work with them. And so I just want to, you know, because it was really you that they were talking with, and Rick, and you showed them that they could trust you guys and have faith in you. So I just, you know, I thought it was pretty amazing how all that went down. That's all. Just want to give them props.
You control your own destiny. Yes.
And when somebody does come in, then you have subdivision regulations and addressing many things such as stormwater, required park space, conservation of natural features, storm sewer, water, sidewalks, street lights, all those things have to be considered on these. You can do things well by considering a lot of goals the village might have as part of one thing. For instance, stormwater management often was looked at as just a hole in the ground to get water out fast. Where it's much better to look at that to say, all right, we're going to combine this with our park areas, and we're going to make it functional to play on. We're going to make it look good. We're going to put some native plantings in or something. So it becomes a feature, it becomes a plus in your community, and it serves a lot of purposes rather than just a hole in the ground that gets water out fast. And we can find those around here and show them to you. They're not good. So that's just like one example of many things that you're going to consider on these. Kind of the same thing we kind of talked about these things. We talked about that. Some of the things that you guys typically do not deal with, we already mentioned building code, property maintenance. Some of the things you're not going to ask typically is, in order to make a decision on a project, is how is it laid out inside? You know, it's a commercial or some business or something. It doesn't really matter in your role of what you're doing. Or I heard they have bad financing, or I heard they did a bad development in another town. That's the kind of thing that you don't want to consider really in what you're doing with these projects. These are things that you know that this is part of what your goals are as a planning commission, that's for sure. You know all these things for the most part, but one of the things that's often not done is once a thing is built, to go out and check it out. Did it really turn out like you thought it would? You know, and then if it didn't, you gotta ask yourself why, and then you come back and have a talk about it and figure out what might be done differently next time, or what might be changed in your code. I think the mayor knows these. Other groups, everybody has a role to play. This can show you how complicated projects can be when, say, you want to improve LaGrange Road or do something with water reclamation district or expand water service. You're running into all these other agencies and permits and things, and that's why it takes longer.
Any other questions on what we've covered so far? Keep going. Oh, one thing I should add is Bob and I are both planners, we're not attorneys, so occasionally we will say, we can't really answer that, you need to talk to your village attorney. But we can also address some things just from our many years of experience about how other places have handled certain things. But if we defer to your village attorney, that's why. So the planner is another person that has a role in the process, obviously. They're guiding the applicant, guiding the public, answering everybody's questions, making sure they're fair with everybody, fair and objective with everybody, and they're not here to take sides or to promote or discourage a particular development one way or the other. There is a staff report that comes from your staff for the Planning Commission, for the Zoning Board at your hearing, and it covers these sorts of things that will help you make your decision as you go through the public hearing on a particular case. Mentioned the village attorney. Typically, they don't attend a hearing. I don't know what your practice is here in terms of.
They typically don't,
Yeah.
but if there's a complicated case that comes forward, they're available to represent.
Yeah, that's pretty typical about how most places handle it. But they are a resource. If there's questions that come up, you can ask Lauren to check with the village attorney about some part of your zoning ordinance or something else. Maybe it's a procedural item that you need clarification on. The public, obviously, they have a role to play, and hopefully they behave themselves during the meeting. So the developer is obviously a huge part of getting things done on your projects. They build the stuff that you want to see in your community. In most instances, it's not the village themselves that's building a project. There's a developer involved in one fashion or another. They have to provide you with all the information you need to reach a decision on their project. If there's conflicts that come up with neighbors during the construction project, they have to work with the staff and work them out. And whatever requirements or conditions were placed by the village on approval, they have to conform with those requirements as long as the project is there, unless there was some other short-term condition that was imposed. The developer obviously is talking to staff, hopefully right at the beginning, to get some idea about what the village expects and wants on a particular piece of property. There's a lot of rules. Each community does have rules. The problem for the developer is each community that they go to may have a different set of rules. It can get confusing. Sometimes the developer doesn't ask the right questions. And financing is a real key. Without the financing, without the market study saying it's feasible to do whatever is being proposed by the developer, nothing's going to go forward. So now we come to your part in the process. Obviously be prepared, know what the project is that you're going to be discussing on a particular night. If you have any questions ahead of time that you think about ahead of time, contact the staff. It may be something really simple they can answer right at the hearing. It may be something that needs a little bit of digging in some past cases in terms of precedent or something. It may take them a little while to look up. So if you do think of it before the hearing, give them a call or send them an email. Obviously, be active, listen to what you're being told by the petitioner, by the public, ask questions, make sure you understand what the project is and consider how the project relates to your comprehensive plan. Is this something that your current plan or the plan that gets amended with the process with Halsey Levine, is this project consistent with that? Is that what the community wants to see there?
I just want to add back on, contacting me before the hearing questions. Because sometimes, if you can let me know in advance what your question is before the hearing, outside of the hearing process, I can work to get you that information and have it available either before or at the hearing, or have the developer or the applicant prepared to provide that information to you at the hearing, so that if it's critical, that it doesn't result in a continuance, and that you have all the information that you need to make a decision in a timely manner. We may not always be able to get through an application in one hearing, but it's nice that we can make that our goal and do everything that we can as, staff and recommending body and a decision-making body to be able to have that information that you need available to you, so that you're fully informed to make a decision and be ready to make a decision. So I'd just like to put that out there to you guys, so that I'm always available for you all to call me and ask me any questions you have about the applications that come before you.
Thanks, Lauren. On some of these complicated, controversial cases, the atmosphere may be a little bit charged. Sometimes it's difficult to be respectful of everyone because they may not be respectful of you, but the idea is, as commissioners, you are modeling the appropriate behavior, even if not everybody in the audience is. And when the whole hearing is done and you've heard all the testimony from the applicant, the comments from the public, and you're getting ready to vote, it's really important for the applicant, but also for the people that are in the room, most of whom are probably coming to a public hearing for the first time, not the developer, obviously, or his or her expert witnesses, but the members of the public, it may be the first time at a public hearing. So it's really important, as they listen to you take a vote, that you explain why you're voting either to support or to recommend denial, that it relates to specific standards, and we'll get into that in a little bit, so that the public can understand it's not just a matter of, oh, you like this person or you don't like this person, or it's kind of an arbitrary decision or whatever. But there's very clear objective standards in your zoning ordinance. And based on the evidence that the applicant has presented and members of the public have presented, you're voting this way or the other way because of that testimony, that evidence, and the standards. So the chair is really the most important person in the room in terms of running the meeting, both from a procedural standpoint, going through the right steps, and also making sure that the meeting process doesn't get out of hand, that everyone is being heard, and but the meeting is going along and not getting bogged down in extraneous matters. Make sure that everybody does have the right to speak. But it's also important to think about, as they're speaking, how relevant is this to the standards review. If they're repeating themselves, the chair can politely ask them, do you have anything else to say that you haven't already said? Making sure that if someone gets up and says, this guy's been a terrible neighbor, he doesn't cut the weeds on his grass, the grass on his property grows too long, too high, the chair can say something like, thank you for bringing that to our attention, we'll have the staff look into it. But the fact that he hasn't maintained his property in the past does not relate to the standards of review and to whether you're going to vote yay or nay on a particular project. That would just be one example. And also this important one at the bottom, which sometimes is very difficult if it's a controversial case, is the number of people in the room. First of all, does not necessarily reflect all the people, all the residents in the village. And secondly, the number of people in the room who speak for or against a project is not necessarily how you yourself are going to vote. You live in a small community, it's often difficult to take a position in the opposite of what you're hearing from many people in the room on a particular evening, but you have to vote based on the standards, not on some of the emotional statements you may or may not hear on a particular case. So the procedure, this is just a quick outline. Each community is different. We saw from your website that you have a great handout that explains the process, that explains all the steps, and that's really, really helpful for the public so that they understand there is a structure, there's a framework of how these public hearings go. And I'll just point out one thing here. Before a vote is taken, it's important for either the staff or the chairperson to briefly restate what it is you're voting on, not to, go through the whole report, but just to say, they're asking for a special use or a PUD or variations, and just so people in the room know, okay, this is what we're voting on, this is what we talked about, and this is what the vote is going to be about. Questions? Comments? I'll keep going.
Well, I know that I find at most of these hearings, people come out when they're really angry or against something, and nobody shows up to support it. So that's why I think it's really critical, like you said, not to consider how many people are in the room for or against something, but to stick to like the actual text and document or legal perspective of what you have to say.
And it's hard because you are a village. You know a lot of the people that are in the room. They may go to school with your kids. You may go to the same place of worship. You see them in the grocery store. They live down the street from you. Whatever it is, it's not like you're voting and you represent, the city of Chicago with millions of people, and you may not know anybody in the room. But that's what the standards are there for, is to help you reach a decision and to, in some fashion, give you cover in terms of what decision you're making on a particular case. The findings of fact, they're geared to making sure your decisions are consistent with your comprehensive plan and also with your zoning ordinance. There was a case in Cook County going back 60 years that was decided because it went all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court. And basically the ruling was by the Illinois Supreme Court that zoning is constitutional. It is something that municipalities in Illinois do have the authority to undertake. And it can't be arbitrary or capricious. And as Bob mentioned a little bit earlier, it relates to the police power, it relates to health and safety issues. So it's not something that, while it may seem abstract at times, there are real reasons why communities have zoning ordinances and the process that you go through when you're voting on a case. So these are the LaSalle factors. It's basically looking at what's going on the property, what's going on neighboring properties, the zoning, the uses, if the property has been vacant, abandoned, underutilized, has it been in that state for just a couple of months? Maybe it's that way because the owner of the property is asking too much in terms of a sale price for the land, or maybe it's been vacant for 6 or 7 years. That might be a little bit different circumstances about what's going on. And this balance of the gain to the public versus the hardship to the owner that would occur because of your decision, and also the weighing of the impact on property values. How much is the owner's property value diminished by the zoning ordinance? How much is allowing him or her to do what they're requesting? Will that impact the property values of the surrounding neighbors? So 2 things that you talk about a lot, either at the Planning Commission or the Zoning Board, are special uses and variances. So special use is a type of use that's not necessarily a bad thing. but it's something that needs to be reviewed a little bit more in detail. Very common special use would be a drive-through. A drive-through restaurant, maybe even a drive-through bank. Not necessarily that the bank itself or the restaurant itself is a special use. They may be permitted uses, but the drive-through is a special use. Why? What do drive-throughs impact? They impact the traffic in the surrounding area, ingress and egress. They can impact noise, particularly with a drive-through restaurant and a squawk box. So there are impacts from those uses. So that's why they're a special use and why they come before you to consider things like, what's the design? How is it going to operate? What's the configuration on the site? And then you have the ability to impose conditions that are relevant to the standards. For example, if it's a drive-through restaurant, maybe the restaurant is open until 1 a.m., but the drive-through you're going to ask to close at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. because it's so close to single-family homes. That would be a perfectly legitimate condition to impose. If it's an existing use in, say, a small business park, the fact that a new use is going in that's not generating any more traffic, you can't then say, well, this is a bad intersection, we're going to make you put in a left turn lane or a right deceleration lane or whatever it is. If that's not directly related to the impact of the new use on the neighborhood, you can't really do that. So these are, this language about special uses are the standards for special uses in the Palos Park zoning ordinance. Now, the standards from town to town in the state of Illinois are often fairly similar. And if you wanted to find a good way to put yourself to sleep one night, you can get a bunch of zoning ordinances from around the Chicago area and read them and see, at least in terms of the standards of review, they tend to be pretty similar. So I'm just going to go through one or two to give you an example of what we're talking about. So one standard will be the proposed use is not detrimental to the health, safety, morals, or general welfare of persons living or working in the vicinity. So an example would be you have an existing house of worship. It's been in the neighborhood for many years. There hasn't been any impact from it. They are going to build a parking lot, which triggers a special use. Hypothetically, I don't know if that's true in your zoning ordinance, but the impact of the parking lot, it will get people off the street, the cars off the street. The parishioners will not have to cross the busy street to get to the church. And the church has agreed that they will landscape the parking lot so it doesn't impact neighbors on the other side. And the lighting for the parking lot will be low level and aimed so it's not going to spill onto the neighbor's property. So that would be an example of something that would meet one of the standards. Another one that we talk about is injurious to property values. So another quick example would be the school district is proposing a one-story addition to their existing building. The property adjoins commercial uses on 3 of the 4 sides, but is adjacent to residential properties on the rear. The design of the addition is compatible with the uses in the neighborhood, and the site has a berm along the rear where it abuts the residential properties to protect those properties. So this is in the handout, but it's just to give you an example of how those standards work. So for variances, a variance is something that is needed to relieve a practical difficulty or a particular hardship that's unique to the particular lot involved. So when you're reviewing the variances, you want to look at, what are the conditions on the site itself that may trigger the need for a variance that's not needed, a few blocks over. And how has this particular project been designed? What's the impact on the community? So let me give you quickly one or two examples. So one of the standards relates to physical conditions of the site, such as size, shape, slope, or conditions that are worthy of preservation, such as a creek, a wetland, or specimen trees. And it's without a variance because of those individual things I just mentioned, one or more of them. It creates a substantial burden and making it difficult to develop or use the property. So a hypothetical example would be there's a stand of mature oak trees on the lot involved. And so the homeowner, because of those oak trees, would not be able to put, say, an addition, a proposed addition to their house in a conforming location. So you make the decision to grant a variation because preserving the oak trees, it's a hardship to preserve them, but if the addition is built in what would normally be a non-conforming location, the loss of the oak trees is a detriment, is a loss that will to the neighborhood as well. And another one would be the variance is in harmony with the purposes of the zoning code. So hypothetical example, the lot is the only lot in the area where its rear yard has steep topography because it goes down to a creek that's in the adjoining forest preserve. Because of that steep topography at the rear of the lot, the owner is building a new house. They're asking for front yard variance to move the house a little bit closer to the street because of this unusual condition on their lot. And hypothetically with this case, this particular instance, this lot is located at the end of a cul-de-sac. So granting a front yard variation, which normally you don't want to do too often, doesn't really impact any of the other lots on the street. It's not like you have a block where all the houses are at exactly the same distance from the street. So there would be another example.
I'd just like to add one example of the fact that the hardship, unique hardship, is supposed to be associated with the site, not with the person. So this is where we seem like we're mean people, but what the code is really saying is, if somebody, someone has an elderly parent, they want to not provide a ensuite for, bathroom and a bedroom on the first floor. Well, they can't do it without violating the setback, requirements of the code. And the lot is a perfectly normal lot, so there's not anything unique about that lot. But what they're coming in and asking for is to consider the hardship of my family because, this is happening. And I mean, we're all human beings. We all, feel sorry for them and want to help them. But we're just bringing up the fact that that's not a justified variance because basically that person can move next year and then you have this non-conforming house sitting there. Somebody else could actually make up a story to get something, come in and request it about their family or about something, and then you're kind of stuck considering these things. So that's just to let you know that you're on solid ground if it's a unique hardship with the lot. But once they start bringing in their own personal hardships.
Yeah. I was at one hearing where the applicant said, "My wife is a lousy driver. Therefore, I need a wider garage to give her more room to move the car in and out of the garage, and it needed probably a side yard variance to do this." So that's another example of what Bob was just mentioning. That's not unique to the lot, to the actual land. It's
not unique at all.
Well, I'm not going to go there. But anyway, so.
I suggest that maybe he parked the car in the garage for his wife.
There are ways that, yes, exactly. That's great. Okay, we will continue. We get a lot of questions about what is a conflict of interest in terms of your being able to vote on a particular case. The idea is a conflict of interest is a financial conflict. It's not any other type of conflict. So that you have a business or a financial relationship with the applicant. You may be a client, you may be a customer, or you may have an ownership interest. So there's also what we call the appearance of impropriety, where somebody may think there's something amiss because perhaps it's your sister-in-law that's coming in for a particular request, but you're not involved in any way with what your sister-in-law is doing, and so you would disclose it at the beginning of the hearing just so people know that you've mentioned it and it's on the record, but you are perfectly able to go ahead and participate and vote.
Do you have to give the reason? So if there's a relationship, do you have to disclose that in a public meeting?
We would
Abstain from the vote?
Yeah, in terms of, let's use the sister-in-law example. She's going to be coming in and opening a restaurant in Palos Park. So if you're selling her the land, that's a conflict. If you're renting her the building, that's a conflict. If you're providing her with the kitchen equipment or the restaurant furniture, that's a conflict. If on an ongoing basis you're going to be providing her with food or with beverage, that's a conflict. If you're going to be an employee, if you're a part owner, those are all clear conflicts of interest. You would have to recuse yourself. If, however, the only benefit that you're going to get from your sister-in-law opening this restaurant is that once a year you may get a free pizza, that does not rise to the level of a conflict of interest. But it's important that if there is a family relationship or some other relationship, you do disclose it on the record at the beginning of the case, and just say, I'm confident I can consider this impartially, and then continue on.
And if you're uncomfortable, even if it's not a conflict, but you think it looks bad, you have the right to still recuse yourself.
Yes.
We can still leave you for that assumption.
So other things that aren't a conflict is if you're voting on something that's going to apply to everybody. For example, you're recommending to the elected officials a zoning amendment or an amendment to the comp plan. That's kind of something that's at a universal level. Or if it's a request from an organization that you're a member of, but the only benefit you're going to get is it'll be easier to find a seat in church because they're doing a small expansion. That's not a financial conflict. And we already talked about the last one. So there's, yeah.
It's not a conflict if you live in an area where you feel you're directly going to be affected. That's not a conflict.
Right, if your neighbor's proposing something, that's not a conflict of interest.
Or if the development is going to be near you.
Right.
That's not a conflict. It may impair, it may change your judgment about a project, but it's not a conflict.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So ethics is covered both under the state law, which we've got the citation up there, as well as the village code. And it applies to elected officials and also to all of you as appointed members of the Planning Commission or the Zoning Board. Basically, it covers two things: gifts to you from people that are involved in the development review process, and certain partisan political activities. We're not going to spend much time on this, but we just want you to be aware that this particular issue is out there. And if you have any questions about it, you can check with Lauren or ask her to check with the village attorney. Ex parte contacts, this is important. It relates to a contact that you have with someone that's going through the zoning process, that may be an applicant or it may be an objector. So if someone comes up to you and says, I really hate this proposal and you have to vote against it, what you should say to them, I'm glad you're interested. I hope you will come to the hearing next week and tell the whole group why you support it or why you're against it. If you can't come, please drop a letter at Village Hall, send an email to Lauren. She will make sure that your letter or your email correspondence becomes a part of the record so that everybody is aware of what your feelings are. Then at the hearing, you should indicate that Mrs. Smith came up to me, maybe it was you were at the site, just seeing what was going on at the site before the hearing, and she's opposed to it, and I just want to get that on the record that she came up and talked to me. That way it's all, out there. Unfortunately, in Illinois, we have a long history of smoke-filled back rooms and decisions being made that are not transparent. And so that's why this is very important to your how you conduct yourself at the meetings. Open Meetings Act, we understand from Lauren that you've all taken the training, so we won't spend any more time on that unless you have questions for us. Everything you do is at a public meeting. If you're talking about a particular case, that is a public hearing. If it's something like tonight where it's kind of a general workshop, there's no particular specific piece of property, then it's just a public meeting. And in that case, the 48-hour notice under the Open Meetings Act applies. If it's a public hearing, the notice is much more stringent because it's about a particular piece of property. So, yeah.
That's, so as the mayor, I get lots of calls. So I just want to make sure I understand. Obviously, I don't want to give my opinion or how I'm going to vote, because basically that's saying I can't give a fair hearing, because the hearing is where you learn everything. Does that also mean that I can't discuss things that we consider here's,
Thank you for bringing that up, because this is a very good point.
Because this is not always easy. We're in a small town. People will come up to all and say, what do you think about this? And they will not be happy with the answer from the plan commission. They're going to want to discuss it more than that. But, so I'm going to let you answer the question.
And Bob, you can jump in here too. There is a difference in terms of ex parte between an appointed official, which is the members of the Plan Commission and the Zoning Board, and an elected official. Because Plan Commission and Zoning Board, you are the official body that is taking all the public testimony on the case. And what you are voting on when you get to the point of taking the vote is pretty much in a box of the standards of review and the findings of fact that we just talked about. So that's why ex parte is very critical for you as appointed members of those two bodies to be aware of. When it gets to the elected officials, what the authority that you guys have, guys on is broader, and what you can consider when you're taking your vote is broader. So you aren't as circumscribed by the ex parte. Do you want to? Yeah. So does that answer your question?
I just want to draw this out because I think it's an important thing, and it's not easy, especially in a time like this where if something is controversial, we get calls. So we're not saying that people can't discuss it or give people facts, but the importance is you can't do anything that compromises in anyone's eyes your ability to hear.
And be objective.
Which is, well, to hear it fairly, you may have an opinion, and you may have a strong opinion, but if you discuss that with members of the public, there's going to be the appearance that you can't be fair.
I think, for the members of the commission and the zoning board, you disclose it, you know. So Mrs. Smith came up to me, I was at the site, and she objects to it. And so it's on the record, or she supports it, it doesn't matter, either way. So it's on the record. If some neighbor was driving down the street at that particular moment when you and Mrs. Smith were having a conversation and you didn't put it on the record, they're going to say, aha, there was collusion, a popular term these days. There was collusion, there was some secret discussion, there was blah, blah, blah. In your role, it's important that all of the facts and evidence that you, as a zoning board or plan commission, are weighing and are considering in your vote is on the public record. That's why this is so important, that a side conversation that you had needs to be just explained and mentioned, like I just said, so that people are aware that it happened, and also that if someone says, well, Mrs. Smith doesn't have all the facts, did she tell you about this particular issue or whatever, so that people have a right to know what was said and to challenge it if they disagree with it. So that's why this is important to you as the appointed officials, to not fall into that trap. So just disclose.
And there's one more trap too, that is if you're out, say after a meeting, the group likes to go out, and many places do that. There's an ongoing case, and there's a quorum present, at a pizza parlor or something, and somebody, naturally wants to talk about it, but there's a quorum there. It's first of all, you can't, and because you're a quorum, you can't discuss it anymore. It's an ongoing case. So you shouldn't do it, but if somebody hears you, and, then the attorney of the person who's going to be voted no on catches wind of this, then everybody's in big trouble, because they can now file a lawsuit or have some more leverage to get what they want, which is not what you want, because a quorum went out and we had this discussion. I have to admit, I used to always go out with our planning commission if they went out, because if I heard any inkling, it's like no. So it's just something to remember, because especially if you're out somewhere, people can overhear to see that. That could be a problem.
Would you agree, just a comment on that, to help minimize that, having like you're commenting in the beginning of the comp plan, having that current in the zoning codes and building codes, having all that current, so you're not having to go against something, granted variance. Like try, you're always going to have to, have a variance here and there, but minimizing that by having the codes, the zoning codes, building codes more, everyone's in line, they're more current, it's not dated by 15 years, and we're having a granted variance. To get the objection from the public, because if it's in the code, then kind of what you're saying in the beginning, it's a lot easier to just say, hey, our comp plan says that if it's on a busier street, we allow more density, and we can give a variance on the side yard setback and do it at 10 feet instead of 15, whatever it is.
You've anticipated a lot, because you listen and see what's going on around you, and change things as they go along, and you hear things. So it's all about anticipating it and setting it up ahead of time, right? But that always means that someone's got to keep thinking about it and changing it when needed. And many towns don't.
And, an example of that, there's a community on the Fox River. East of the river was the older part of town, smaller lots, smaller houses. West of the river was much newer development, larger lots and larger houses. When they redid their zoning ordinance, they wrote the new zoning ordinance for the single-family districts as if all of the town was west of the river. So when people were trying to do something who lived on the east side of the river with the smaller lots, every time they needed to do even the smallest thing to their house would require a variation. And that's not how you want the process to work. So, they figured it out, and they amended the zoning ordinance fairly quickly, so that, it's perfectly acceptable. It's a good thing to do, to have different districts in the community to represent the different development patterns that you have. They're not all going to be the same, just like what you would want, just as an example, a way of a sign on LaGrange, which is, a wide street and a lot of traffic moving quickly, versus, a small little area where it's, just one or two or three little storefronts, and people are primarily accessing that area via foot, and so they're looking at the signs in a very different manner. So it's important that over time, as development patterns change, you keep up your zoning ordinance, and Bob mentioned earlier, as technology changes, 25 years ago, nobody wrote zoning ordinances to address the issue of cell towers. Well, now that's something that we have to think about, or 30 years ago, however long ago it was. But, so that's an example of keeping up with what's going on, so that you...
Follow to that, too, is that even notwithstanding changing stuff later on, you may have your existing zoning ordinances be inappropriate for certain neighborhoods. I mean, in Orland Park, when I got there, we had zoning districts, many hundreds of homes. I mean, everybody completely non-conforming, everything. So if they wanted to do something like Lori said, they wanted to go and get a loan for some addition or something, they're going to run into problems because they're not conforming. So we had to go through and evaluate all these neighborhoods, and the majority of lots were certain size, certain setback. You had to create zoning districts to accommodate what was there. But they just threw on these zoning districts, that somebody made up later on, and they didn't fit at all. So I don't know if you have that in Palos Park, but that's a problem for property owners to have the inappropriate zoning on their property. You can't spot zone and change each one individually, but if this is a neighborhood where it actually can constitute a zoning district. So that's just something to be aware of.
We're almost at the end. Thank you for your patience. These are just some resources for you, specifically for planning commissioners. Every year at the state conference, the American Planning Association, which is typically in September or October, we do run an all-day session specifically for plan commissioners. Last year it was in Naperville. This year it's going to be down in Springfield. I think it's back up in Chicago the following year. But it is a fairly affordable, I forget what we charge, $100 or something, way to going to the national conference, which this year is in New Orleans. Not a wonderful city, but not terribly convenient. The Plan Commissioners Journal, there at the bottom, plannersweb.com, all of the information on that website is free, and it's all geared towards plan commissioners, not towards professional planners. So that's a really terrific resource. Some different websites here. You've got the state chapter. You have CMAP, which is the regional planning. We didn't talk about that. Regional Planning Agency for the 7-county area. Chattox is there. And also Pete Pointer's website. He is a planner, an architect, and an engineer who's been involved in the Chicago area for many, many, many years. He's written books. He's taught. He's also been in practice. He has a lot of wonderful information on his website, which is also free. Other questions or comments?
And we're happy to hang around if anybody has something specific to come up to us.
If you could quickly fill out the evaluation forms. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
All of you have been appointed boards, not because you have some philosophy, but because you all bring something to this role. We in the village council are always looking for input on any issue. So I'll give you my cell phone. Many of you have it. For those who don't, it's 708-341-7261. Anything pops in your mind. If you go on a visit to some faraway place or some close place and you say, God, it would be great to have something like this here. There's something that's bothering you. We're a small town. The mayor should be accessible, all the commissioners should be accessible. That's the way I hope it to be. So
Yeah, the ex parte thing, that to me is real difficult. I mean, it's hard.
It's hard, we get a lot of questions about it in all the communities, because it's difficult.
Rick, do you have anything to add? No, I just want to thank Bob and Lori for coming out